We welcome you all to this lecture titled Rewriting Muslim Histories, 1948 Police Action and the Case of Hyderabad. It needs no telling that how important this topic is, especially because it also is telling in the sense that it tells us how collective memory functions. While partition looms large over our post-colonial consciousness, has shaped our discourses, our sensibilities. Somehow, 1948, one of a sort of a genocide in Deccan history, in modern Deccan history, unprecedented, has not, we haven't been able to notice it. And that is something very fascinating in itself as how it has eluded academic discourses and also popular consciousness. I think this lecture and this book by Afsar Mohammad, Remaking History in 1948 Police Action and the Muslims of Hyderabad, should address that lacuna. And it's very fascinating in that sense. I think it is very important because it, in a certain sense, hints, because we don't know much about it, it gestures to that connected history of coming into being of a nation immediately after tiding over the victory of non-violent struggle against colonial rule, and then the deep fault lines that occurred immediately, just a year after independence. And that should really be something telling us about the contradictions in the body politic of the nation state that came into being. And the last, and perhaps the because there are not many works, as Afsar Mohammad tells us, and Hilal Ahmed was saying that there's one book by Nurani on Hyderabad. But the one that I read was not an academic book, but some sort of an insider's perspective on this episode in history. That is, again, Muhammad Pathaidri, October Coup, a memoir of the struggle for Hyderabad. So I think that we have really an opportunity to engage with this past that has eluded us so far. So welcome, and it's yours. And I should say that, I'm sorry I haven't introduced you. Afsar Mohammad teaches at Pennsylvania University in Philadelphia. And I think what's interesting is that when his writing is it's not just based on textual sources, but rich oral testimonies and interactions and literature. So it should be quite interesting engagement and a rich, narrative of what we are likely to hear from you. Poet. Oh, he's a poet too, I'm told.
I'm trying to use my South Indian identity to address you. Oh, thank you, Hilal Bhai. Praveen is here. Ayodhya. And then I feel like I'm really in US today, since I see my advisor, my professor and my guide, Professor Don Davis here in the audience, and then Mary. They are like my family back home. Home means it's complicated usage, but I say it is still like home, right? So this talk basically just to introduce this book, nothing more than that. I want to talk about how we can erase histories. There are two dimensions here. One is vernacular histories, and then there is also this big question about Muslim identity formation. Of course, for me, the most important thing is this Hyderabadi identity, Hyderabadi Muslim identity. How is that Hyderabadi Muslim identity is different from other locations? When you are talking about Hyderabadi Muslims, what are the components that come into play? So I'm going to take around 25 to 30 minutes. So that we are used to 50 minutes in classroom. So 45 minutes is good. And then I will leave room for questions because I feel like we should have a conversation rather than me addressing from this podium. That's not the nature of my teaching also. So thank you. Thank you so much. I see like this is like wonderful audience today. I look forward to your comments, questions. You can be as critical as possible. I I try my best to be a gentleman. So let us see how that goes. How the slides are you going to? Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. In many ways, speaking about Hyderabad is nothing but speaking about myself. When I say this, it's not my subjective perception. Rather, I would say it should be the same for many Hyderabadis as well. We're all Hyderabadis are all some reflections, the beautiful mirror of Hyderabad. I also see a lot of Hyderabadis here. Here, Sunita just came. It is not the same story for everyone. Although we feel like we are the reflections in this Hyderabadi mirror, but everyone carries her own story. Each person and each community, each caste has its own version of Hyderabad. And it is peculiar way of historicizing Hyderabadi past. While there are many dimensions to this historicization of Hyderabadi past, today I begin this conversation with a key idea in my book, The Politics of Mainstream Histories and the Urgent Need for Excavating its Invisible Histories. So I'm using that invisible histories so that that gives you a sense of where I am going. Now we are at this point of history where we don't even recognize the fact that there are multiple histories. In the process of hegemonizing the culture of Hyderabad and Telugu, the big history has become a norm and the rule. The idea of Andhra and Telugu displaced the identities of Telangana and its bilingual presence of Telugu and Urdu. Along with the public media and literary mainstream, we have in most cases simply subscribed to the authoritative structures of these two dominant political and cultural ideologies. In the book, I'm also critiquing the Telugu nationalism, which became actually some of the writers from Telangana, they called this formation of Andhra on November 1st, 1956, as the Black Day in the history of Hyderabad and Telangana. So that is also one of the ideas I'm trying to understand and then explain in this book. Similarly, most methodologies and search engines just serve the mission handed over by the dominant political and religious systems. They never let us acknowledge multiple histories or plurality of voices. The immediate question now should be, how do we decenter such singular methodologies and hegemonic systems? If so, are there any alternative methods to dismantle the high power of these mainstream histories? I have no simple remedies for such a huge dilemma. But I just want to say that I have been operating here within some available light, such as local Islam, Muslim being and belonging, and the archaeologies of local knowledge systems. Throughout my journey that spans more than 2 decades of ethnographic research, My entire effort has been to explore such possibilities, relying heavily on alternative histories. While seeking a response to the above two questions, today I emphasize a key term: invisible histories. In the case of Hyderabadi past, we have even bigger concerns due to the prominence given to the idea of a linguistic state that led a kind of linguistic nationalism, along with many other forms of nationalism and state-sponsored political authorities. In understanding Hyderabadi history, we need to pay attention to what kind of histories and whose histories have been made invisible. In other terms, we need to check who speaks for whom. Most importantly, we need to be cautious about the politics of data and the availability of sources that play a huge role in the making of history. What kind of data is available? And who is producing this data? What language sources are they using? We need to continually reflect on these questions as we work through our sources. Such an approach helps us to create our own narrative space. Rather than submitting to a majoritarian or master narrative, we are required to take note of many sides that have been relegated to margins. The data and sources made available by a majoritarian discourse deliberately silence minorities and their voices. We are being repeatedly told the same stories that are produced by majoritarianism, dominant religions, hegemonic castes, gender, and male dominant politics. In the name of a complete or integrated history, we end up in a bundle of lies or half-truths. We are constantly pushed to listen to the same old histories that are nothing short of any mythology. With this brief introduction, now I will introduce my new work. We all know these times are extremely challenging, and we have many questions parading before us. They all force us to seek some urgent responses, and not any response squarely meets the demands of our mind and heart. We are all trying to find a new idiom to our pain, the pain related to our own identity and our own interactions with the larger community. This book came out of such pain of being and belonging. As I start working on this talk, I read a statement from the American Academy of Religions that says, quote, "In moments like these, we uphold the importance of scholarly inquiry. We call for freedom of information and caution against the dangers of too easily spread disinformation. We strive to promote free inquiry and critical examination for all scholars and to create space for listening to those who have historically been ignored, exploited, and silenced," quote ends. With a similar idea of scholarly inquiry, we need to approach the police action of 1948, which was buried under heavy disinformation and the subsequent lack of empathy for the silenced, exploited, and ignored voices. Those voices still remain feeble and smaller even after several decades. This book is almost about 350 pages. It's not possible here to sum up everything from the book. Also, I'm not a big fan of providing summaries. Rather, I will just focus on a major argument from the book, the politics, as I said earlier, the politics of mainstream history and the making of alternative histories. I will show how ordinary people, this is the category I am emphasizing in this book. It's neither Hindus nor Muslims, ordinary people from Telangana, from Deccan, from Hyderabad state, perceive and interpret history. how various versions of history would be produced and circulated through different times, spaces, and communities. Slide. Before getting into the actual story of the police action of 1948 in Hyderabad and Deccan, I just want to promote my old book a little bit, not just as a sales strategy, but only to give you a sense of the direction of my work and mission. This is the book I wrote under the guidance of Professor Don Davis, who is here in the audience. I'm so happy he's here today. For the last 2 decades, I have been trying to capture several aspects of local Islam in my research and teaching. Theoretically, we can call this Islamicate or Persianate, with my focus being more on vernacular languages and cultures as experienced in the South Indian language of Telugu and Deccani Urdu. In 2013 publication, The Festival of Peace, I started speaking about the idea of local Islam and its multiple manifestations. Based on the historical battle of Karbala, when the Prophet's grandson and followers were martyred, I tried to show how the entire history travels to South India and how the 7th century battle, historical aspects of Islam, were being translated into a local idiom of public rituals and narratives in Telugu and Deccani Urdu. Everyday Muslim, this book tries to bring some evidence to talk about the trajectory of local Islam, everyday Muslim life, and its connection to some Islamic past. But most importantly, the contemporary dilemma of Hindu-Muslim exchanges. Note that it was also about a historical event, Battle of Karbala. And my story was about how that history metamorphoses into a local story. So what is the connection between Karbala and then how it travels all the way to this local language, local community, right? It was in 2006 when I was still conducting field research for this old publication. I ran into a Muslim folk performer, Abdul Qudus Sahib, who was then almost 78 years old. While I was completely focusing on oral narratives of the Battle of Karbala, many times he kept taking a detour to talk about the violence of the police action. His students who were learning these Muharram songs from him were little impatient and asked him repeatedly, just focus on Muharram, nothing else than Muharram. Just share the Karbala stories. Then what he said, Qudus Sahib said, that's the very inspiring statement I ever heard from one ordinary person. The quote begins, you people don't know anything that happened in our immediate past. And you are endlessly fascinated by some remote past, 7th century Karbala. Try to understand the immediate past, the very yesterday of our history. Quote ends. To continue with Qudus Sahib next. The police action, that was his statement. The police action was an end of many good things in our lives. We lost not only many friends, our personal careers, houses, and most importantly, the beautiful light. So this is the key term he was using from Quran, ihsan, and the tahzeeb culture of our everyday life. If someone says it is just about a few Muslims, no, not at all. It's a pain about the entire community of the then Hyderabad and Telangana. So that's a picture of a Muharram performance in Telugu villages. Qudus Sahib is known for these Muharram performances. Since then, my mind was wandering in two worlds. The Battle of Karbala from the 7th century Iraq and the police action of 1948 in Hyderabad, Deccan. Two different locations. and two different histories, two different cultural dynamics of religions. Hinduism also, of course, in this case, you see in the picture, a lot of Hindus participate in this Moharram performance. The actors are different, the agents and the factors of those events are totally different. The story of the police action begins on August 15th, 1947, the Independence Day of India, when the borders of India and Pakistan were filled with the blood of thousands of people, while the new nation states of India and Pakistan were negotiating land and power, the citizens of the princely state of Hyderabad experienced the unraveling of an intense political conflict between the Union Government of India and the local Nizam of Hyderabad. In the process of integrating the Hyderabad state, the government of India initiated a military invasion, codenamed as the Operation Polo, but locally popular as the police action. Actually, I actually used that word, that this was actually military action, not the police action. But I just wanted to, because police action is like a popular word even now in like public vocabulary. So I just took that word. Between September 13th and 17th of 1948, the entire state was occupied by the Indian military, killing thousands of people and displacing some thousands. According to Qutb Sahib, I'm going back to him, he said, this blood had no religion. It is of Muslims, Hindus, and Christians, quote ends. Next slide. According to Sundarlal Commission, which was officially appointed by the Indian government, it was estimated that nearly 27,000 to 40,000 Muslims were killed in Deccan, and some thousands migrated to the other parts of the world, including Pakistan and the USA. The entire report was classified by the government, considering it as a national security issue. This report was not available until 2012, even though there are a wide array of oral narratives, anecdotes, and conversations being circulated in the public. Since the entire argument in this book centers on challenging the mainstream history, if there is anything like that, I'm not going to buy the idea of mainstream history. I will just speak about how this challenge works in this book. To give you a sense of this critique, I need to talk a little bit about how ordinary people, not Qutb Sahib like an expert, but I was also, I actually interviewed 100 people from different sections. Unfortunately, we lost 90 people during the COVID. So we don't have any evidence now to talk about this violence. So this is the last document of those 100 lives and their stories. Unlike scholars and pundits, these versions offered by ordinary people, as I show in a while, push the boundaries of a narrative by transforming into more inclusive, diverse, and multi-layered narrative. Like Qutb Sahib, most of the witnesses in their testimonies connect the histories of Karbala and the police action. While there are several ways of producing and circulating this mode of alternative histories, the very mention of the Battle of Karbala in the context of the police action remains intriguing even now. So this was the the picture, the image of the map of the war that happened between September 13th and 17th. You can see the military invaded from different directions. Sorry, the image is not that clear, but it shows like how from 4 directions they entered into Hyderabad and invaded. And then the official media, so they see that the title, while the official media and governmental documents describe this as a happy war, I don't understand what kind of Is there a war? That is like happy war. That's what kind of vocabulary is this? Ordinary Hindus and Muslims of Hyderabad state use the terms Vuchakota. Vuchakota means, and then Khun Rezi in Urdu. Vuchakota means massacre. That is the word being used in ordinary, by ordinary people. During one of my scholars such as Umar Khalidi used the term Hyderabad Holocaust. During one of my conversations, people like Qutub Sahib and Jaini Malay Gupta, one of the freedom fighters and Urdu literary activists in Telangana, compared this event to the Battle of Karbala. But they lamented that. Actually, this is the statement given again by Qutub Sahib. He said, at least there was Hussein to fight at that point for the community. There are no Husseins left anymore. Now, despite all the massacre and bloodshed, we became orphans. Quote ends. Next slide. Most official documents project an anti-Muslim sentiment. And even the leftist writings, this is one image from Telangana armed struggle, which was one of the dominant stories from the late 1940s in Hyderabad. Even the leftist writings, they also ignore this massacre and privilege the Telangana armed struggle that happened between 1946 and 1951. And the other story that was dominant during at this point was the state formation of Andhra Pradesh that ended in 1956. During my field research, so most of the witnesses, they challenge these two stories. And then they say that Muslims were never given any role. Muslims were never mentioned. They never mentioned even this massacre in these histories, official histories. So we always talk about these two big events throughout the official histories, right? During my field research between 2006 and 2020 in and around various regions in Telangana, I heard from my interlocutors about the idea of Tarikh Katha. This is very interesting vocabulary being used by ordinary people. It's a blend of Tarikh as history, Persian word, and then Katha is like a Telugu usage. Of course, it's Sanskrit. So they blend it. So now we're like talking about head and white, historical narrative, and all this stuff. But this is there, already there. People like, they know this kind of vocabulary. So from these conversations, I gathered that they use this term, which is a blend of Telugu and Urdu words for what can be called the historical story. This term is commonly used by the Telangana folk performers to authenticate their version of Karbala story, not like normative Islamic story, right? So using similar term in the context of Telugu narratives of the police action, I understand many witnesses from Muslim and Hindu groups too were trying to recycle similar popular performative practices. In this world of storytelling or history telling, there is no definitive line between the terms history and story. In other ways, using this term also allows them to engage with various historical events in an alternative mode, which by all means contest mainstream historiography of nationalism and the singularization of religious identities, and then the Telangana history. In the process of understanding the happenings between September 15th and 17th, another key source was literary fiction, including short stories, novels, memoirs, personal essays, and autobiographical writings. According to one of my interlocutors, actually the image of this book, the cover image, this was in 1949, Hyderabad, people like sitting outside a chai shop, Irani chai shop, and reading newspapers. So that kind of, that shows, that's the image that represents the reading public of that day. How popular newspapers were, like how popular, the other aspect is progressive writing. So when I was talking to this Varalakshmi, who was 16 years when all this violence was happening, but she died during the COVID, he said, in fact, I felt that the fiction writers of my times were closer to the dark reality of the day than historians and journalists. Both historians and journalists, they are repeatedly using the term happy war to describe this violence. But in their vocabulary, in their historical narrative, that was not a violence. That was a celebration of liberation from Nizam's rule. To see the different viewpoints. If you want to understand, I'm going back to her quotation. If you want to understand what was happening in an ordinary person's life in Hyderabad of my generation, you should read fiction. That is where my generation learned more about all that was happening. And that is where the real history is. So, but she used the Urdu word. She came from Saiva Brahmin family. She said, she Asli Tariq. That was the term she was using in the conversation. So that is another key term for my work. Note her emphasis on real history and the usage of Tariq. During the conversation, she was actually switching back and forth from Telugu to Urdu in a very natural flow. That speech behavior too shows how they are in love with Urdu and Muslim cultures even in everyday life. Varalakshmi was not even 16 when the police action happened in 1948. And she just got married to Kaviraja Murthy, another Saiva Brahmin, progressive writer from the late 1940s. But he wrote in Urdu. After the Telugu state formation, he switched to Telugu. So this is another sad matter, sorrowful thing, switching from Telugu Urdu to, this is the same case as Premchand in Hindi literature. So first written, his novel, My Garib Hoon, is one of the primary sources in my book. First written in 1949, as an immediate response to the police action, this novel portrays many moments of the bloodshed and trauma. But most importantly, this writer created the characters of both Hindu and Muslim political and religious leaders, literally mimicking their public behavior and their speeches during this period. Some speeches were taken verbatim from the actual public figures of the day, particularly like speeches by Qasim Rizvi and then other like prominent public figures, and then Hindu religious groups. Next slide. So here I need to talk about my sources in this book. These are the sources I was trying to use. That's historical documents, both official and unofficial. Of course, they are very rare. We don't have any archives to talk about this violence and trauma. But the most important for me is these witness testimonies. So who survived this violence. And then, but as I just explained, there are literary and personal writings. This personal, I want to emphasize that personal in this kind of new reading culture. So because of the new print culture, so they started writing their personal memoirs, experiences, sharing about the violence and everything. So Varalakshmi, in fact, represents a new generation of the reading public that evolved in the aftermath of the police action. This is one of the important aspects for me, how this reading public evolved, what they were reading, why they were reading that kind of material, and then who were producing that kind of material. This book documents how such new public sphere, associations, and the reading public were working together between 1948 and 56 in the Hyderabadi Deccan literary culture. Despite the violence and trauma, the Hyderabadi community, this is another important aspect I was trying to highlight in the book. Hyderabadi Muslim community was resilient and produced a new set of discourses, including progressive Islam, gender equality, social justice, and composite cultures of Hindu and Muslim identities. So those were the major themes they were talking about after the violence. The chapters in this book portray and analyze these crucial turns in the history of Hyderabad by juxtaposing oral histories and written sources. So that is methodology. I have to like blend both of them because sometimes oral testimonies might not work. Sometimes literary evidence might fail, right? So I kind of try to blend them. Next slide. The book's journey begins with a debate on the rise of a new Muslim, Naye Musalman. That was the category used in post-1948 Hyderabad. So that was a category used by ordinary people, not like scholars, not historians. But I tried to analyze who are these new Muslims, Naye Musalman, and then how they are, what issues were like big for them at that point. Still struggling with the aftermath of the violence, we encounter a new generation of Muslims, Muslim men and women, who engage with the larger networks of Islam and multiple sources of modernity being translated into Hyderabadi idiom. Most of the Telugu writings and a few Urdu writings from Hyderabad describe this shift in Muslim being and belonging with an emphasis on urbanity and industrialization. This is another dimension I was trying to explore. What is the role of urbanity and then industrialization? Next slide. Oh, no, there is, oh, okay, that's fine. I already explained that. Next slide. Yes. So this billboard was very popular when I was growing up. This is a billboard about Charminar cigarette. I think some of you might have experienced it. And I never tried. It is supposedly like really, like, I don't know how to describe that. It's very strong cigarette. But also see, this kind of represents, so whoever like have a Charminar, they're like this, have this masculine kind of, it takes a Charminar to satisfy a man like you. I actually, to be honest, I never subscribed to this kind of ideology and the masculine politics. As mentioned before, the new generation Muslims now deliberately made a choice to take advantage of the benefits of higher education, like the establishment of the Osmania University. These are all happening the same time. So this Charminar factory was established, and then all the Muslims, like the who lost their, while upper caste Hindus, they were looking for upward mobility. So Muslims of Hyderabad undergone this downward mobility. So they lost their positions, they lost their economic sources, they lost employment. They couldn't find employment. Oh, you are a Muslim? No way, we can't hire you. This kind of like everyday conversations made them like really frustrated. But the Usmania University, and then there was, on the other hand, increasing efforts to utilize the foundations laid by early reformers. So this is like very interesting dimension. Like on the other hand, there was suppression of Muslim community. And then to counter that, new generation Muslim men and women, they started using their own kind of tools, like girls' education, breaking the barriers of traditionalism, women came out of Janana, inner courtyards, and they participated in public discourses and then public performances. And then most important is like they kind of started developing these networks with global Islam. And then they started engaging with print culture. And then leftist politics, even though they were not happy with the leftist agenda, they were, because that was the only source available to engage with the public for Muslim men and women. So they were using leftist politics as a tool to reconstruct their community. So The 4 chapters in this book, there are only 4 chapters, narrate the story of new Musalman, Naya Musalman, but also they take note of lower and middle class Hindus, Dalits, and Christians. So, because that's an inclusive story, there is no way that we can separate Muslims from these communities and caste groups. Even upper class and aristocratic families, namely Ashrafi Muslims, they also entered into larger public space that stresses multi-religious, multicultural cosmopolitanism. So they are trying to reconstruct that idea of Hyderabadi Tehzeeb in a new vocabulary, using new idiom. So you took advantage of leftist politics to redefine that Tehzeeb. At this instance, I realize we need to comprehend the limits of such a narrative because I'm using literary sources, right? Because I'm very skeptic about literary sources. As many of you know, being historians, we don't consider literature as a good, like a very resourceful tool, right? Particularly being a writer, I want to be honest, I don't believe that much in writers and poets. So they're kind of, their reality, their portrait of reality is like somewhat distorted, right? So we can see that even in these literary sources. There is, because as a scholar, we need to handle this material carefully. So we need to make a difference between where this writer is like taking advantage of the situation and then trying to come up with his own caste, upper caste narrative. That's the most important aspect for us. And then anti-Muslim sentiment. These two things were together in most narratives. So there is no escape from those two aspects. So because I'm actually, I want to talk more about the methodology, but I don't know, Priyadarshini garu, 10 minutes. Thank you. So I'm going to conclude here with this last segment of the talk. Next. So this is like one of my favorite lines because I love Aga Shahid Ali. Even though he was a Kashmiri, we kind of share the similar like pain of Muslim being and belonging. He said, "My memory keeps getting in the way of our history." So this is very important for a historian, like how collective memory and then history works, and then how dominant histories like corner, like marginalize collective memory, right? So there are tensions between history and memory. So when I read this poem, line from a poem by Aga Shahid Ali in 1998, it immediately resonated through the restless chambers of my mind and heart. In Hyderabad, on 17th September of that same year, 1998, I had witnessed a public rally of the right-wing Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, and had listened to India's then Home Minister Lal Krishna Advani giving a provocative speech, invoking anti-Muslim sentiment. In Hyderabad and Telangana state, Advani declared that September 17th, when the military invasion ended and then Hyderabad was integrated into a new union government, it should be celebrated as the Telangana Liberation Day. Telangana Vimukti Dinam, Vimochana Dinam in Telugu. That charged declaration stoked 100 questions in me about the history of Hyderabad, a history which is already replete with intense memories of Muslim lives and their discourses between the 30s and 50s. On that September day, which marked the 50th anniversary of the integration of the Hyderabad princely state into the Indian government, the BJP was jubilant, celebrating the event, conveniently ignoring all the massacre. But could we really call it a celebration, given that violent history that led to the killing of thousands of Muslims and Hindus, and to the global displacement and migration of thousands of Hyderabadis? Here, I just want to say something about my own, like this is, as I said earlier, this is very subjective work, very subjective in its nature, very personal. Since the demolition of the Babri Mosque in 1992, the Adwani had already been part of the heightened consciousness of the local Muslims. During this period, wherever I went, I heard resounding critics of Adwani's statements. So, however, September 17th, 1998, so this is like revisiting that police action history, was totally different. Like many young Muslims of the 1990s, I too had grown up with anti-Muslim slogans buzzing around me. Among them, Musalman ke do hi sthan, Qabristan ya Pakistan. A Muslim has only two abodes, choices of abodes. One is the graveyard or the Pakistan, and had been called names such as Babar ke Aulad, the children of Babar, Aurangzeb Waraslu, the heirs of Aurangzeb. You know all these figures. Of course, I don't have to explain how some of you might have experienced similar vocabulary during your like lifetime. But the big label I was given, because I also started writing like poetry and short fiction in Telugu, talking about Muslim being and belonging. So I was given this title, jihadist. Graffiti and jeers constantly reminded me that my mulk, home country, is somewhere in Pakistan. Unfortunately, I never visited Pakistan, but I still been called as Pakistani, right? Of course, after this book, I got invitations from Pakistan now. So I'm just want to conclude now with this picture that was taken in 2021 as I was wrapping up this book, conclusion for this book. So this, I just felt so bad because BJP Women's Wing took this so seriously. So they took out processions everywhere in Andhra and Telangana, even in Andhra. And then displaying all these national flags, BJP flags, and then going around door to door and talking about how cruel are Muslims, how we should all like kill these people if they appear on the road. So this is like a kind of very sad situation. I personally witnessed those. And then, but the narrativization, of course, there is a lot of change in the vocabulary, particularly because I'm using literary materials in this book. And then I also focused on ordinary language of that violence and trauma. I also tried to understand how the language changed, how the idiom of that violence and trauma changed through different times and then histories and also places. But there are other issues like silence of the witnesses are also, like, even though they expect a lot of violence and trauma, they never they don't want to share anything about police action. Instead, all the time they want to talk Telangana armed rebellion, Telugu linguistic state formation. So this, like, there is some like effort to bring back that mainstream history after 1998. And then going back to Kudus Sahib, because I started this talk with then when I published my previous book in 2013, I was teaching at University of Texas at Austin. And then I just started translating and transcribing the oral testimonies. But I was like kind of not that into that work. So the movement was like so intense. I couldn't listen to the audios because of the descriptions of violence and trauma. And then I delayed it so long. And then I continued to delay it. And then one day I got a call from the village of Kudus Sahib. That's he said, one of his students called me, Anna, hi, Kudus Sahib is no more. It was shocking at once. And I put off the transcribing his audio because it was amazing voice. Even he was 76 when he was singing. And then when I listened to his voice on my phone, audio recorder, such an amazing voice. I couldn't listen to it. It was so painful to listen to him. And then took me, actually I was undergoing that trauma, listening to him again, and then his death. And then it took me years to return to his interviews and other interviews. Meanwhile, we lost COVID in 2019, and then we lost 90 of the witnesses. And the day when the family of Qudus Sahib called me, they simply said, Anna, you need to finish writing this book soon. That was Qudus Sahib's last wish, Aakhri Khwahish. Of course, I finished the book, but after almost a decade after his death, I felt so bad about it. I feel so bad about it. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Afsar Mohammad ji. I can't help but comment that it strikes me that having read a little and written on a certain aspect of this history, certain dimension of this history, one can't help noticing the ways in which focus on the ordinary can make to a historical narrative. And it's amazing. I see that this is entirely different, and rightly so. It is an alternative mode of writing history. Broadly, I would say that, in order to facilitate more discussion, there are two basic broader themes here. One concerning methodology in terms of how you use sources. And I completely agree with you here, writing about ordinary people. Recognition of popular history is very important if you want to capture actual history, especially within the Indian context. Because I think people have a particular, especially in South India, a particular way of conserving memory, of articulating it. It's performative, it's through song, it's through proverbs, it's through telling and retelling and, adding more elements. It's more revisionist history. It's not some fixed history at some particular point in a document, or as you would say, it's not just a happy war. There's more to it, right? That is what you get when you go to this, these sources. So there's obviously a blurring of distinction between sources of history as a document or archival source and fiction. Or even performance or memory or katha for that matter. And very importantly, pre-Telangana state formation, the narrative was entirely different about this event in history. It was mostly binary framework you had. It was either depicted as a Hindu-Muslim narrative or nationalist and anti-nationalist framework, or another one very popular though and had a greater legitimacy was the Telangana leftist perspective, right? Trying to say that they were more not only against the Nizam or feudal autocracy, but also against this Indian states, kind of authoritarian power. And it is only recent in a certain sense with the formation of Telangana that a new histories are coming up. And one obvious historian is Arappa Satyanarayana, which says that when the struggle against the invasion, as you say it, against to force Hyderabad to accede to the Indian Union happened, it was a united force of Hindus and Muslims and ordinary people across castes. It was not just Hindu-Muslim conflict. There was a united resistance across religious and caste lines. So that is very important. It is just picking up now, but that is not adequate. These kinds of histories bring in more flesh and and the pulse of the people there. But I should say that what is interesting in your work is that how history suddenly inserts certain epochal changes happen in very short span of time. For example, the Asaf Jahis, the Nizam rulers, ruled for about 2 centuries. And during this course of time, there was this tehzeeb that developed here, and you have Nizams like Mehboob Khan, who was a king, who was a Nizam, who had almost been revered as a peer, a saint, and worshipped by both Hindus and Muslims. And then now you have Muslims being suspected 100 years later, or maybe lesser, as suspect citizens and maybe second-class citizens. So it's remarkable how history changes and how perspectives can change. But I think that there's more to it than just that sort of binary frameworks, and ideological narrative. So I'm very glad to have, and I look forward to reading this book. So I think that we'll have more questions and more comments on your lecture. So anybody wants to make the first comment or have any questions, welcome. Hilal, you would want to start?
Hello, sir. Thank you for the lecture. It was very fascinating. I have a couple of questions. The first one is about I was reading Geeta Ramaswamy's autobiography recently.
Who's that?
Geeta Ramaswamy's
Ramaswamy's, yeah.
autobiography recently. She talks about the people's histories, but most importantly, how. I'm sorry. So she talks about how the landed zamindars, Muslim zamindars, were evicted from rural Telangana by upper caste Hindus, particularly Reddis. Though there were Reddy and Velma landlords, it was Muslim zamindar, Reddy and Velma zamindars. It was Muslim zamindars who were mostly affected after police action. So my question is about how did the leadership of the newly formed state, Hyderabad state, responded to the victims, the zamindars who were evicted from the rural regions in Hyderabad state. That's one. And the other one is you were referring to ordinary Muslim as a conceptual entry to this research. Can you please elaborate on how did you distinguish between an ordinary Muslim with the, let's say, mainstream Muslim or the landed Muslim or the Muslim elites that were part of Nizam's administration previously?
Right.
And the other question is, it's a small question, like how did the working class Muslims were affected after the police action? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You want to answer each question?
Yes. Yes, that's good actually.
Okay. You want to first answer?
Right.
Respond, yeah, you can.
Thank you so much for those three important questions. I actually tried to find responses to these questions in my book. But the first question is about newly formed government. There was actually no response from the newly formed government as related to this massacre, bloodshed, violence. When I gave a talk the other day in Hyderabad, and then they were asking me about what they paid any compensation as they pay in other like violent incidents. Nothing, not even a single rupee was paid to these victims, because they all felt that, even the newly formed government felt that Muslims deserve this kind of killing, this kind of violence. They don't deserve any additional benefits. So they were actually, because this is also, there are a lot of politics even in military invasion, right? Actually, Sunita Achyuta, who is here in audience today, she worked on this responses to this violence. So, but one most important thing, a political aspect, is that Nehru government, although Telugu poets always describe him as a socialist. And then Sardar Patel, they were actually aiming at, along with Muslims, they were aiming at killing these Telangana freedom fighters. Because in 1952 election, there was, everybody was talking about communists coming to power. So both Nehru and Patel were scared that this Hyderabad is like the heart of the country, right? They don't want to lose it politically. So if communists are going to win the election, that's going to establish a bad precedence for Indian politics, Congress particularly. So they don't, because along with Muslims, they killed, even in remote villages, they killed leftist activists. So we have this comrades association. It's not political association. It's just like very cultural, very literary organization. But they even killed the people belonging who were like running or conducting these organizations. So it's like a double-edged kind of strategy. On the one hand, they want to like control Muslims. On the other hand, they want to like not let leftists take the lead. And the other question is ordinary Muslim. It's like a complicated category. I know that when I was using the term, I clearly know it's not easy to theorize it. But I just took a took an adventurous step. I can say that using that category, because when you use that kind of terminology, who is ordinary here, right? One argument in the book is like the tensions between elite Muslims, Nawabi Muslims, and then Garib Muslims, right? So after the industrialization, like Charmer factories, there were a lot of textile factories during this period. And then even in remote Telangana, there were factories, newly established factories. So it's all basically like they produced new working class. It's not just Muslims. So like they're like Dalits, Christians, and everybody there, like lower caste, lower class community. So when I was using this term in this book, it's a more inclusive term. Like I'm not excluding Hindus, Christians, or Dalits from that usage. So it's very like it's a beginning of the debate anyway. I want to see how other communities, other caste groups. There are a lot of questions now about Dalits rewriting the history of that particular period. I'm so happy about that. Women historians, they started talking about this now. So I'm so curious about these new developments. So when we have those like materials available, we get a clear sense of how ordinary works, right? And of course, working class is actually that is one aspect I discussed in a chapter like new new Muslims. When they are talking about new Muslims, they're basically talking about working class in that category, right? Muslims lost their position, lost their power, and they became something lower class, right? So that shift from Nawabi or some Ashrafi kind of elite kind of lifestyle to this low level lifestyle, that's very aspect of post police action. So I think that aspect, I just introduced that idea in the book, but I believe it still needs a lot of exploration. Thank you for those 3 questions.
Since you said this was a very personal book, I was just wondering, that I guess what would you, what how does today's politics inform this writing of, like rehashing of a memory? Because
Mhm.
I mean, times are such that we have to talk about 2014, pre-2014 as some kind of golden period, which is ridiculous.
Mhm.
And 1948, of course, is itself such a terrible rupture in Hyderabadi culture and
Mhm.
Hyderabadi Muslims, their lives, our lives. Just wondering how you kind of handle the criticism of leftists during the period and of Congress, which of course was just enormous but hollow from the inside.
Mhm.
It had a huge range of members. So, but from sitting in 2023,
Mhm.
how are you looking back at this um this terrible memory for Hyderabadi Muslims?
Thank you. Mhm. So Congress politics, actually, it is connected to your question as well. But personal, you are also talking about that aspect, right? But I am actually, when I am using that term, it is not really personal, right? Like it's a very political statement, right? Everything personal is political, right? So, but as it related to Congress politics, actually in 1998, I documented one folk song. It's not a folk song uh, in its real sense. They they used the folk narrative song style to talk about police action in 1948 in 1998. So so this is in Telugu. This sounds really beautiful. How many colors you don, Nehru, oh Nehru? How many colors you don, Nehru, oh Nehru? How many colors you take on, Nehru, oh Nehru? Now the real color of yours is out, Nehru, oh Nehru. Tata's on the right, Birla's on the left, Truman on the head. You call yourself a socialist. Now we know your real face, your real color, Nehru, oh Nehru. So this actually is like very popular in 1998. Maybe Achita, Sunita knows this very well, right? In Telugu, this sounds really beautiful, very powerful. Sorry for my poor translation, but I tried to bring that music into that. So Nehruvian politics, for so many years, even during this police action, Telugu culture was fascinated by Nehru's socialism. There are a lot of poems. When he died in 1964, there are a lot of elegies, like describing him, eulogizing him as a symbol of socialism, as a symbol of communism. When I read that kind of poetry in Telugu now, because of course, most of these poets, they are my favorite poets too, no doubt about it. But when I read those poems, I felt so bad. What kind of political consciousness was there? How long you are going to romanticize these figures, right? Nehru, like such a fantasy for Nehru those days, right? So same as Sardar Patel. Sardar Patel was like proto-Hindutva at that point, right? How could you start with Sardar Patel's, if you read his letters about Kashmir, about Hyderabad, you kind of, there is no way that you control yourself, your blood kind of. So this is the person we are talking about. This is the person for whom we kind of put on like huge statues, right? So this all shows the other side of Congress politics, right? So I'm very critical about Congress politics. And also, of course, I'm also equally critical about leftist politics here. So they also, when it comes to Muslim question, they had similar kind of viewpoints with little difference. right? So in this context, there is nothing personal. Everything is political. Even if I say something like Hyderabad, is like my other self. It's a political statement, right? But we need to understand what kind of Hyderabad I am representing. What kind of Hyderabad leftists were representing. What kind of Hyderabad Congress people were representing. And then what kind of Hyderabad MIM represents. So these things, we need to unpack all these political aspects to understand the connection between personal and political. Makes sense?
Just to add before I say this, what is interesting is that Hyderabad provides, as a princely state, a Muslim princely state, because if you see it in a larger framework of, about 500 plus princely states during the period, we had Hindu princely states and Muslim princely states. And now, post-independence transfer of power, by Hindu states could be seen as Ramarajya,
Right.
models of autonomy, Hindu autonomy. Muslim princely states could be seen as incomplete,
Feudal.
incomplete freedom struggle. I mean, it did not complete. It was there was no freedom in the actual sense of it unless you brought that earlier enemy, outsider, into power. That was it. And also, it was not just about that, but also about contending nationalisms. Hyderabad nourished a Deccani nationalism. Right. And obviously the Congress had its own anxieties. And what makes Hyderabad particularly interesting is that it brings on the surface the Hindu anxieties within the Congress. Munshi, who was a resident of Hyderabad, he is actually repulsed by the fact that the Muslims think they are ruling race, and he feels that the Hindus in Hyderabad are emasculated. They needs to be, in a way, encouraged to participate in violence, counter violence against the Muslims. So you see, there are larger factors in play there. Sorry for taking this long.
No, this is good. Go ahead. I will respond to this question. Speaker Lijie. There is an opportunity to use speaker, so you should use it.
Yeah. So the event has the character of, this entire. So I was thinking on those lines that post that thing that happened in Hyderabad, as you are dealing with the oral histories and testimonies. So you might have came across, I haven't read the book, this idea of being Muslim and how this particular event shaped their subjectivities of being a Muslim.
Right.
And Hyderabad also dealt with a lot of violence. So that event again occurring in time and space.
Right.
And this idea of ordinary and eventful. So how these two are connected in time and space, and the question of subjectivities as the people felt about the violence and post-violence, how they are making or starting their normalcy, the idea of normalcy, which is being disturbed with this episodic violence. So just a little bit on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Actually, they're still they still have the trauma. So when I was talking to these people, like 75 years, and then 90, some of them are like 90 years old. When I was talking to them, they were still kind of experiencing that trauma. They still feel like, oh, army was coming, and then they were invading. They're like destroying their houses. They're separating the families. They lost families, friends. Lot of literature in Telugu, not that many, but some good stories like actually portray this separation of families, right? So, but immediate after, like the one thing that made me look back into this history was the resilience of Muslim community. So they were trying to, this is the title of the book actually, Remaking. So they were trying to remake their history. They're not forgetting the past, but they are trying to live in the present. And the one thing that happened, actually, my good friend M.M. Moit from Hyderabad, he published a piece on this one wonderful Muslim organization, Tamir-e-Millat, the reconstruction of Muslim community, Tamir-e-Millat. So this organization came into existence after police action. Along with the other side is the establishment of Siyasat as a newspaper. Siyasat at that point was not just a newspaper. It was a social device to cultivate a new awareness among Muslims. And then these organizations, they actually responded to this violence, because most new generation Muslims at that point, they were just teenagers, right? 16 to 25 age group. So it's really impacted them so much. They couldn't even utter a single word at that point because they were still like having that traumatic phase. So the one thing that they tried to do is like, you got to articulate yourself first. So you got to talk about, speak. It's like there is a talk therapy, psychological therapy. So that is one thing that they tried to do. And then they promoted this new educational tools. And then they also had, because there was also a suppression of Urdu language after the police action. It is similar, like partition kind of situation. So they also started promoting Urdu, because that is the only language they can speak, right? So these things actually made post-police action, of course, a lot of violence, trauma, there is no way they can come out of it. But the community, the positive attitude of the community to reconstruct everything, that is like one of the big accomplishments. So that is where I use this word Naya Musliman, new Muslims, as an idea. Hope that helps.
There's just a response from one of our virtual participant here. That is a question for you. The question is, we get to hear a lot of bloodshed done by Razakars. Could you throw some light on the emergence and their significance on the police action? I guess this is an important question because
it's very important question.
I think the fanaticism of Razakars can't be left unaddressed in this, if you can call it, because there was Hindu violence too.
Right.
So what are these two polarized factions?
So there is actually a chapter in the book. I took that statement from one Muslim woman who suffered, who was witnessed this violence. Sorry. All Muslims are not the Razakars. That's a statement given by her, because the conflation of like these two terms, Muslims, all Muslims are Razakars. That's like a common vocabulary after the police action and during that period, right? If you see a Muslim, oh, he's a Razakar. So there is no other term to describe Muslims at that point. So they started demonizing Muslims as Razakars. But if you look into the history of Razakars, that is what I tried to do in this book. How many of them were Muslims? Not many. Razakars, they were basically upper caste Hindus. Most of them. Sunita, could you say a little bit about that?
Could you take the mic, please?
Yeah. She did wonderful work on Razakars.
Not on Razakars, but pre-48 Majlis-e-Ittihad al-Muslimin, which started its wing, this militant wing in 1947, actually after the day of the 15th August. So this was the time that they felt that, because there was, I mean, this is based on the records of the Majlis and based on the other accounts that have come out later, that basically this whole thing of Razakars was 1 year old, between August 15, 1947 to September 17th, 1948. But this 1 year has been conflated and 1 year has been written back for almost 2 decades in later literature and later histories. And, it keeps getting like these memorial days that BJP revived in 1998, which is started in 1998 in Telangana. This Hyderabad Liberation Day constantly reproduces this narrative of Razakars being for decades and conflates Majlis, pre-1948 Majlis-e-Ittihad al-Muslimin, entirely with Razakars. 20 years of his existence is seen as Razakars. Like what Afsar is saying, that all Muslims are not Razakars. Majlis was not Razakar. Majlis had a whole lot of factions: moderate faction, extremist faction, our Professor Javed Alam's, who you all know, his father was a president of Majlis, one of the presidents of Majlis. So there was a whole lot of history to this. And like Afsar is saying, Razakars had a lot of Dalits, because in the Aurangabad area, Majlis, Muslims were the workers, Muslims were the peasants, and under the feudalism, there were Hindu landlords. And so it was very popular at that in Aurangabad area. In fact, Muslim who joined Majlis were agitating against the landlords. And in a whole of Telangana, Majlis, the Razakars acted as the actually defenders of the landlordism. They in fact lived in the houses of landlords. And this is something that Sundaraya also writes in his book. There's nothing new. And a whole lot of Telangana villages also, most of the Razakars were actually employed by the landlords and on a payment. So they were all Dalits. A whole lot. And you have heard of Shamsundar, B. Shamsundar, who was called the Ittihad, Dalit Ittihad or something like that he was called by others.
Yeah.
Sorry? Ittihad Harijan. Yeah, Ittihad Harijan he was called because he worked in the... So this is a complicated history, and they're complicated, which in the current narrative, in the narrative that is popularized, all this has been flattened, and it comes to us as this one thing or the other.
Thank you so much.
Go to the next Hila.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting lecture. Since mostly on the methodological part, so I would like to make a few comments. So these are not questions, so you need not to answer them right now. And you have answered one of, like when you explained to your understanding of politics, but this is nothing to do with politics. First and foremost is when you say that you are using literary sources to construct a historical narrative, I think there is another possibility. And the possibility is that in literature, the idea of past is also evoked in number of different ways. Now, in your case, what are these ways? What are the specific form in which the past is actually used in a literary way? And when we look at Urdu literature, we find a very interesting trajectory. And the trajectory is that, especially even in post-colonial, even colonial India, you find that most of the historical imaginations are offered in fiction, be it Iqbal or Ghalib, and then they are saying things in, or Hali. They're making statements of historical kinds in a form that is popular. But these people, when they are making political statement, this is completely different. Yeah. Now, this is a specific form in which past is used as a source to construct a historical narrative. But in your case, you are reversing it. Now, in order to do that, you have to specify the method by which you are reversing it, which I didn't find in your presentation. At least I haven't seen the book. That's first comment. The second comment is about history-memory divide. And it's a serious question, because we tend to see history and memory as two conflicting, or as a binary in which one is contradicting the other, which is not the case. Because if you look at the theoretical literature on history-memory relationship and the kind of memory we have, the modern memory is actually influenced by the historical events, the way in which history is coming to us. So therefore, to say that memory is traveling independent of history, and especially the mainstream history, is not correct. Because what so we remember is inextricably linked to the manner in which the past is presented to us. So for instance, I'll give you one very revealing example. 6th December, we all know. 6th December 1992, it was celebrated all over India a decade ago as a day when Babri Masjid was demolished. Now, when I visited Ayodhya, I find no, that's not the case. The 6th December is not the day which they commemorate, rather 30th of September. Now, what is interesting is that 30th of September 1989 was the day when Shilanyas took place. What is interesting now, if you look at the website of this trust, which is now building the temple, 30th December is the day that is to be commemorated. So historical events always contribute significantly to the popular memory. So therefore, we cannot say that history and memory are two intrinsically two different things. So that's also important to remember. My final point is about everyday Islam. It is almost fashionable to talk about everyday religiosity. We all know that. But to expect that everyday religiosity will counter dominant narratives is rather simplistic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bilal, for the comment.
You want to take that question also, or
Yeah,
are you?
sure, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
It is related to what
Yeah.
Right.
was said. So, sir, I am a social anthropologist by training, so slightly a misfit in this audience. But yeah, I have few questions on the methodology that you have employed
Right.
in order to produce your account. When we say alternative history, or these intellectual projects of which are like involved in the exercise of recovering lost voices, lost histories, and those kind of works, isn't it that when we say alternative history, we fall back into the same trap? Because these alternative histories or these accounts, their credibility is always measured as against to those standard national histories. So it's not a value neutral term, I guess, this alternative history. I'm sure you have done justice to that in your book. So this is the first observation. The second observation is how did you deal with the problem of authenticating these oral voices? Because the credibility of historical account is always measured, and this is something I don't relate with. I mean, I totally respect these survivors and their voices, but the way mainstream histories are written and get credibility in the mainstream circles, there's always a bias in which you prefer written archive over oral archive. So how did you deal with that problem? Because your work is based on those oral archives and oral voices. Secondly, somewhere you mentioned in your presentation that some of your interlocutors were silent on certain things. So can we take silence as a mode of exploration itself? So that's what we as ethnographers do when we go to the field. And so, yeah, these are three broad set of observations.
Thank you so much. Should I respond to this? So I'm always skeptical about intellectual projects because I basically come from ethnographic, ethnography, right? So I believe more in ethnography, studying people as they appear there in the field. So, but in the case of Hyderabadi history, Deccan history, you can clearly see how these different dimensions of intellectual projects, they actually silenced many voices. So there are so many examples right from the beginning of Vijaisri Garu was mentioning about Mahbub Khan earlier. So we don't have any history of Mahbub Khan, right? Because we don't want to study the positive dimension of Nizam's history. We just want to project because of the leftist hegemonic historiography. They would just want to project Nizam as an enemy, right? So they kind of erased that kind of history. Even they erased it from the memory, right? And the other thing is authenticating. Who am I to authenticate anything? I'm just learning from them. This is one piece written by my advisor, Don Davis, in American Academy of Journalism. That piece is so beautiful, learning from. So I'm just learning. I just want to I'm not there are a lot of statements in the book, even about Razakars. I'm not buying any of them. I'm just trying to put them in perspective, locate them within that history, and then see how their vocabulary could be utilized to understand that intense moment. So I know some of these people, when the moment comes, they kind of, as you were explaining, they read it from the present, right? Always they do that. I'm quite aware of that kind of manipulation of past. So that I'm not going to use that word in my work. So I just take it's as a learning tool. That's it. And I missed that question about silence.
Asking, can we take those moments or narratives
yes,
of silence seriously to produce?
Absolutely. Actually, I had to wait several years to meet these witnesses again. So I actually waited some of them to meet some interlocutors because they don't want to say anything. Particularly when it comes to the chapter itself begins with that silence. About Razakar's chapter is there. She gave me this statement when I was Razia Begum. She was 75 at that point. I asked because she came from this leftist background. She don't want to talk about anything else. Her entire way of looking at history, like this left from the lens of leftist politics. But after a while, when I met her, she tried to bring that question of Razakar by herself. And I never asked her again because I don't want to press them, right? Pressurize them, right? I just waited for that moment. And then when she came out with that mention, so this is, she was talking about these, there are a lot of statements given by her in this book. So the first thing she said, this is after a lot of silence. So silence is also very important. We need to understand why they are silent about these things, why they are silent, particularly in the case of Razakar. Most Muslim leftist freedom fighters, both men and women, even though they were suffered a lot, they never responded to any of my questions. I just traumatic moment. So there is a way of studying silence as well, right? We cannot make judgments. We need to understand, okay, why this particular person, right, when I mentioned about certain things. As Punita was explaining, there's a lot of history back of that silence. Actually, we need to write a book about the history of silence later. Maybe in future.
Yeah.
I think that related to you is also a larger, reflection on how pain or trauma is interconnected with silence. You know, I mean, you have,
Same with partition.
yeah, that is it. And also, I think that there is a tendency to automatically grant authenticity to written word.
Right.
Rather than spoken word. So it is a long-established tradition. Why would we automatically think that the written word is, legitimate? And even that is also subject to dispute. I mean, there are multiple versions of a
Right.
particular event, even in a written text. So obviously, if you are investigating a mass of people, people may come up with different narratives. So it depends on how we would want to bridge in the connecting points, but obviously the spoken word brings in memories that are not recorded in the written word. So that in that. But anyway, we can go on and on. Any more questions?
He's actually waiting for that.
Well, what are the roles of non-literary forms such as folk songs, folk dances, folk music to rewrite hidden oral histories of common people, unrecognized people? Role of
This is very important question. Again, going back to methodology, because because I just mentioned one song about Nehru, right? That's coming from the below. It's not like intellectual kind of product. So during the Telangana armed struggle between 1946 and 50, folk songs played a huge role. Most Telangana poets, progressive poets, and then folk performers, they recycled the devices of folk literature, particularly long narrative style. That actually came from, they recycled it. Most, even modern poetry in Telugu, that actually recycled that long narrative style. So particularly, of course, some of you who are familiar with Telugu poetry, Arudra's long poem about Telangana, it runs for 100 pages, right? It actually came from, say, long poem, long folk song. So there is actually going back to those folk songs, and also there's so many other forms. Like there is in the book I discussed about one folk genre called Burrakatha. So they use tambura and tell the story, right? So 3 performers tell the story. So there is the title of this story itself is Police Charya, police action. That was popular. That was so popular during those days because Congress.
Title? What is
Katha, like is like it's like retold from the lens of Congress, and then all Congress performers, Congress party, when they go to villages, they particularly trained some performers just to play this folk long narrative. So they kind of, even now that's, the popular folk now Burrakatha performer, his life story also had some connection with this.